A couple of days ago, I received in my inbox a message from the Armenian bishop in London. In it, he expressed distress and concern about the fate of some 120,000 Armenians in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh who were pretty much being cut off from Armenia and the rest of the world by Azerbaijani forces and environmentalists. He basically raised the red flag, reminding readers that this is very serious, that this could lead to ethnic cleansing, that this could evoke memories of past genocides and past ethnic cleansings suffered by Armenians throughout history. And he basically said, who is going to help? Can anyone help? The message was not only sent to the Armenian community in the United Kingdom, it was also sent to all other church leaders and dignitaries who might have a say in what happens next in the South Caucasus, where the hot conflict has recently, over the last 2 weeks, become even hotter. I read that message. I made a couple of mental notes and I said I will get back to it later. And today in church, it's the 1st of January. I wanted to start the year by attending Divine Liturgy. Today in church, the parish priest also referred to the dire situation faced by the Armenians in the enclave and how they were being deprived of food, of medicine, and how slowly but surely they were being asphyxiated politically, physically, with nobody around the world really caring for what happens to them. This is serious. Of course, it's not the only conflict in the world, and it is a conflict that is almost always under the radar because it does not have the sense of urgency of some other wars or some other conflicts. But it is one that gambles with the lives of many, many hundreds of thousands of innocent men and women caught up in political and military poker games. Now, why has this suddenly happened? If some of you remember over the past 2 to 3 years, I've often spoken about Armenia and Armenian matters. And in 2020, I talked about the war there that ended with Azerbaijani victory and Armenian defeat, about the loss of a lot of territory by Armenia in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. And even then, 2 years ago, I began expressing the concern that this is not going to end well, that this is not just a question of Azerbaijan regaining the occupied territories that were its own, or its incursions into Armenian territory in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. I suggested that this could become more nefarious and more threatening, a conflict in the southern Caucasus for the Armenians in the enclave, but also for the Republic of Armenia itself. And without claiming to be a prophet, I certainly am not, without claiming to be the foremost authority on this conflict in the Southern Caucasus, I certainly am not, I believe that some of my fears, concerns, predictions are actually happening today. And what the bishop said, what the parish priest repeated today, what is being reported here and there in dribs and drabs is basically an indication of how serious the situation is. Let me recap a little bit. After the 6-week war, Russia and President Putin imposed a truce. And that truce was very basic, just a few points. But the important thing was that the guns stopped. And there was also a lot of talk about a process that would actually open the road to the exclave of Nakhichevan on the Iranian border, that it would do this, it would do that. But of course, the key point that happened was that Russia put a couple of thousand or a few thousand, let's say, peacekeeping forces along the line in order to make sure that the contact points between Azerbaijani and Armenian forces or communities in the enclave did not lead to further wars, further outbursts, further problems for the region. Now, at the time, I also said that this was quite a strategic coup for Russia because it allowed President Putin and the Russian Federation to have a foothold in this area, which they hadn't had in the past, that it diminished Turkish role in the region geopolitically and enhanced that of Russia. But something serious happened. The war between Russia and Ukraine and the Russian attack on Ukraine. That war has completely messed up the calculations in many, many parts of the world. In Europe, in the EU, in even the MENA region in relation to OPEC Plus and oil and energy supplies, but it certainly has impacted a lot the Southern Caucasus. Why? Because the reverberations are most acute in this region simply for the fact that Russia does not have the wherewithal now to maintain the peace in that part of the world when it is basically fighting for its life in the war with Ukraine. And what has, of course, happened is that since the 2020 war that Armenia lost, the balance shifted. But it has now shifted even further in Azerbaijan's favor. The Armenian army is weak. It is so much weaker than the Azerbaijani army, which is beefed up by Turkish drones and by Turkish support. Also, the replenishment of any losses that Armenia has sustained in the war in terms of weapons from Russia is not forthcoming, because Russia, as its traditional arms broker, is itself in short on supplies, whereas Azerbaijan is getting all the weapons that it needs. Add to this the fact that Europe now depends to some extent, and I think it's a fallacy, but Europe and its politicos think that they also depend on Azerbaijani gas. This has also emboldened Baku to move forward. So we have a Russia that is unable to perform its peacekeeping duties. We have Azerbaijan that is becoming more and more bold and not only increasing the pressure on the Armenian communities in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, those 120,000 who are pretty much under an embargo, as the bishop and the priest said, but also the attacks by Azerbaijan on the borders of Armenia, the republic itself. All this has also meant not only the military imbalance, but it has also overshadowed any peace talks that were hoped for between the Armenian and Azerbaijani sides. Let me remind you, in late 2021, Moscow accepted, perhaps grudgingly, it accepted a European Union-led initiative or mediation between those two fighting countries. It had hoped that this initiative by the EU would also reinforce Russia's peacemaking, which had not been making much headway. But since the war in the Ukraine has begun, Moscow has gradually changed its views about EU diplomacy in the region. And it feels that what the EU is trying to do is not really to mediate between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but rather to curb Russia's influence in the region. So despite EU attempts, despite French and Brussels-led attempts, the Kremlin refuses now to engage with this initiative. As a result, I think what has happened is that there are two agreements floating around. There is one by Russia itself and one by Armenia and Azerbaijan, who themselves, with Western backing, tried to reach a draft agreement. Now, each one of those tackles trade. It tackles the stabilization of the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. It deals with the fate of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. And there is a problem in this particular area. Because whilst Armenia has dropped its demand for a special independent or autonomous status for Armenians in Karabakh, it has always said that Armenians should be able to self-rule, but with special protection. But now Azerbaijan says, no, Armenians are like any other citizen in Azerbaijan. They will submit to the same rules and regulations, which in a normal setting would make sense. But we're not talking about normal settings. The world is replete of cases where majorities dominate and minorities are bullied. This is what is happening now. So the bilateral track that's supported by the West is probably a little bit more promising at the moment than the one by Moscow, by virtue of the war in the Ukraine, etc., etc. But how would Russia respond is pretty much unclear. And both sides are so far apart, with Baku holding all the cards because it knows that it has the military might. Now, why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this not because I want to put down Armenian efforts at defending their nation, nor is it because I want to add oil to the fire. I'm saying this because I think that the situation now with this embargo, with the increasingly bold steps that Azerbaijan is taking, it's almost like President Aliyev now says, I can do whatever I want. The EU will not interfere. Russia is too busy to do anything anyway. So maybe I can actually, once and for all, resolve this issue with Armenians. Now, what does resolve this issue with Armenians mean? Does it mean that he will just walk into the capital of Karabakh, Stepanakert, and take it over, completely take over the enclave? And what is going to happen then? Ask yourself that question. Or is it that the skirmishes on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border are going to increase, and that is going to have an impacting and compacting impact on, wow, that was quite a mouthful, on Armenia itself because of the military imbalance? The danger at the moment is that post the 2020 war, no goodwill has led the talks. And it's clear to me that Azerbaijan doesn't want to talk. It wants to resolve the conflict in its own way. And we all know that when we say Azerbaijan, we say President Aliyev. And this worries me because if the talks go nowhere and there is another flare-up, it would sink both the Moscow and the EU tracks. And what happens is that force would prevail, and there is every possibility that Azerbaijan can take even more territory, not only in the enclave, but in the Republic of Armenia itself. Now, the answer is very difficult for me to give you because I don't have an answer. My instinct would say beef up the Armenian military, and that's one way of saying, if you try to attack us, then we're going to wreak havoc in the whole region, and you will suffer as much as we would. But who's going to replenish? Who's going to beef up the Armenian army? India? Well, there are talks, but I'm not sure. Russia? Well, I just said for 10 minutes now that Russia is absent because of its other concerns. We are in a very, very dangerous tipping point in the Southern Caucasus at the moment. And it behoves well upon diplomats, analysts, people who care for what happens in this region and its reverberations or consequences to act. Because otherwise, what worries me and what basically worried the bishop when he sent out that message was not that there is going to be another skirmish over a couple of miles or kilometers here or there. He was worried that ethnic cleansing of Armenians might happen again. And remember, the Armenian memories of our forefathers during World War I have never been expunged or erased. So all that is happening today is playing into those memories and adding the fear factor, which in itself would add to the trouble in the region itself. So I really hope that a way would be found out, whether it's via the EU, supported by the United States. In my opinion, the only country that can actually now thump its hand on the table and said, this is what's going to happen, which President Biden is not doing. Whatever the outcome, I just hope that the international community would wake up to what is gradually unraveling in the region before it is too late. Otherwise, we would have new frightening memories to add to those of our grandfathers and forefathers. I hope that everything I fear is nonsense and will not happen. But the world community has to wake up, just as some NGOs have been speaking about the conflict in increasingly more alarming terms. Take care. Not the best message to give out on the 1st of January, the first day of a new year, but better be prepared than sorry. Take care.